So Paul, you seem to connect managerialism, we've spoken about that before, with ICT. Can you say some more about that?
Yes, certainly, but perhaps we could begin by using the phrase you've just used, ICT, because I guess everybody knows what that refers to. Maybe 30 years ago or 20 years ago, people would not have said ICT, they would have said IT, quite simply. So there's something intriguing about the way that the word communication slips so sleekly in between the two letters I and T, making the whole thing seem more humane, more user-friendly, something more appropriate to education indeed in many ways. And I would welcome that because I do think that ICT offers immense possibilities for developing new forms of communication, which is to say also new ways of being and new ways of thinking. And I see these as flowing with philosophy rather than being a challenge to it. I think there's an immense possibility for us living in different and in some ways better ways through ICT. But I don't want to go back on some of the negative things I said earlier on. I drew attention to the way that in the 1980s, when many parents of school children were imagining that what their children needed was skills in programming, and when O-level and subsequently GCSE computer studies was developing, at that time it was thought that it would be a future where many people were employed as programmers. We now know that's not the case. What we also realise is that computing figures in our lives in ways that we would never have dreamt 30 or 40 years ago. It's integral to so many of our practices, and it's often in the hidden wiring, of course, that so much of our communication is going on. So that was a false start, I think, to throw the emphasis on computer studies and the like. What was really happening at that time in the 1980s was that computers were affecting the way institutions were running at the level of management. Because the wonderful tools that they do indeed provide, that's to say databases and spreadsheets, wonderful tools to manage an institution in so many respects, they can also have harmful effects when they're allowed to determine the way the institutions run. So increasingly they reconfigured the kinds of information, the kinds of understanding of the institution that were thought to be important, and practices in teaching to some extent became subservient to them.
So ICT, the C in ICT, gives it a nice veneer, a nice gloss, a sugary coating, which we just consume and think it's just generally good. You're saying, think about it some more.
Yes, I'm certainly not being cynical about the sugary gloss, as you put it. I don't think it's just that. I think there is, as we can surely see, real developments in the ways in which we can communicate. I mean, the most obvious example is email, which structures so many people's lives in various ways nowadays. And email is a new way in which people interact with one another. So in some ways, it's like the advent of letter writing. The printing press would come into this story somewhere or other. It's one of those big changes that human beings have had to adjust to. And to some extent, we're still learning how to use this medium. I'm using email as a kind of shorthand for a variety of different aspects of new communications, including, for example, chat rooms and blogs and real-time chat. All these things seem to come into this range where one is talking and communicating in an open-ended way with other people. Now this, I think, offers immense possibilities in terms of education, and I'd like to contrast it with another possibility that computers have generated, and that I'm going to refer to as programmed learning. Back in the 1950s, there was development in the United States of teaching machines that sought to break down a learning process into a series of clear-cut steps, with the possibility of repeating a step if you hadn't succeeded in it, or perhaps doing an additional exercise to help you to move on to the next stage. Now, as must be obvious to anybody who's used a simple teach-yourself program with a computer, computers can provide this kind of learning opportunity in very, very efficient ways. And in some ways, this is a dream as far as a manager is concerned, a manager anxious to cut the costs of an institution, or perhaps a Minister of Education for that matter, encouraged to cut the costs of schooling. It's also a dream from the point of view of the computer companies themselves, because they can and indeed move into education in such a way that they can offer incredible economies of scale that would quite genuinely extend opportunities to many more people. There are probably great gains to be made in poorer countries through the possibilities of this kind of learning. So that sounds good. But what one needs to realise is the grave limitations this structuring of learning imposes on what's being taught and what is learned. That's to say, everything is reduced to bite-sized chunks, clear-cut steps, and with clearly measurable outcomes, of course, in terms of whether someone's progressed successfully through the necessary stages. What that closes off is the possibility of open inquiry. There's no room there for the student who might ask a question that would wrong-foot the teacher and open up an interesting avenue that would not otherwise have been pursued. There's no room here for what the ordinary teacher often recognises, that is to say that so much more is learned than can be assessed in a class, and that so much more includes what the teacher sets out to learn, but which can't be assessed, but also what is not anticipated, what is learned by chance as a spin-off from the material that's presented in a regular class. All those possibilities are closed down in programmed learning. Now, email, which I sought to contrast with programmed learning, seems to me markedly different from this, in that those forms of interaction are indeed conversational. And like a good conversation, they can take off in new directions and in unexpected ways. There may be a purpose to the conversation, there may be an endpoint we're trying to get to, but in the course of the discussion, new possibilities are opened up. A kind of speed is generated, and intensity perhaps, in the conversation, which can be highly important and generative for new possibilities of learning.
There seems to be a kind of iron fist in an iron glove, managerialism and ICT together, which kind of seems ineluctable, inevitable. You've talked before in papers around skill and how skill seems to occupy the third point in this triumvirate of things. Can you say more about how skill relates to this in skill-based talk?
Yes, I don't know if an iron fist is quite the right word. I think the way this operates is much more gentle and more surreptitious as a result. So I haven't seen the new managerialism as something that's calculated and aggressive, but rather as something where the very forms of understanding, partly generated by computer technology, seep into the ways of understanding that the managers have in such a way that they're unaware of other possibilities of thought. That's why I think it's more pernicious. Its surreptitiousness is what I'd draw attention to. But you wanted me to say more about skills in relation to this. If we go back to the time when databases and spreadsheets were being used so widely, and when indeed the point of learning was being understood in new ways, then one aspect of that was that people were starting to understand the processes of learning partly on the model of what a computer does. That's to say with RAM and ROM memory. And so the big thing we all needed to acquire was information access skills. There was no longer a need to remember everything, because now at our fingertips in the computer we would have the knowledge that we needed to use. So as long as we could press the right buttons or move the mouse, we could access this information and then be in a good position to use it. Now this is an aspect of the commodification of knowledge which is a kind of reductionism. Knowledge is no longer something that's vibrant and there in the conversations that we have with others. It's no longer something that's growing and exposed to critical practice in conversation. Instead it becomes units of resource which we access and then utilise for functional purposes.
This notion of conversation, I know Oakeshot's a clear contender there, and disclosing new worlds is something I'd like to pick up with you again. Paul, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.